I am General of the Army Ulysses Grant, and I join you today and invite you to reflect with me in the first part of a series of thinking about my relationship with John A. Mcclernand. But in this first segment, I should like to look at Mcclernand before he met me and at our first coming together, and tell you a bit about Mcclernand. He was born in Kentucky, and there begins the list of similarities between John Mcclernand and Abraham Lincoln. They were both born in Kentucky, and when they were just small boys, they both moved to Illinois. Mcclernand was the son of a Scottish immigrant doctor who'd gone to medical school at the University of Edinburgh. And when Mcclernand was just a small boy, his father died. And they were at that time living in Shawneetown, Illinois, which is just across the river from Evansville, Indiana. It's close to about 16 miles from it and near the confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers. Even though he was the son of a doctor, he had some education and some tutoring, but he was largely self-educated, as was Lincoln. And as Lincoln, when he was about 20 years old, he had read law with an attorney and joined the Illinois bar in 1832. He was born in 1812, which also makes him about 20 years my senior. I was born in 1822. He was also a worker on the rivers, river trader. He worked with newspapers. He started in, I think, 1835, the Shawneetown Democrat, and he also worked with the Gallatin Democrat and Illinois Advertiser in that time. When he wasn't working on the river, then he went into the law practice and developed a successful law practice. He was a contemporary with Lincoln in the Illinois State House for several terms. It's important to note that he became a staunch Democrat, a Jacksonian Democrat, while Lincoln was a Whig. So they had very much opposed political philosophies and leanings, but they were acquainted and in fact were friends. To say they were good friends could be stretching it, but they were contemporaries serving together in the Illinois House and in the United States House of Representatives, where Lincoln served one term. Mcclernand served several terms, I think 3 terms, then went back home to, by now, Springfield, Illinois. He had moved from Shawneetown to Jacksonville, Illinois, to Springfield, and was indeed living in the same town where Lincoln was living, and had a quite lucrative law practice, but more about that a bit later. He got into the Black Hawk War, as did Lincoln. Really saw no action. He was in for about 3 months, again, as was Lincoln, and came back home to practice law. He married in 1845, I think. He married 1842. He married Sarah Dunlap. So, and then they had 4 children, but only 3, only 1 survived to adulthood. 3 died as children. He became involved with Stephen Douglas and became, he morphed from a Jacksonian Democrat to a Douglas Democrat. And he was like so many men of the time. He was pro-union but anti-abolitionist. And he worked with Douglas a great deal. He supported Douglas in his run for the presidency. He supported Douglas in the Kansas-Nebraska Act with popular sovereignty. And he also shepherded through the 5 parts of the Omnibus Compromise Bill of 1850 that Douglas got passed. It failed in total, but when broken into different parts, they all passed. So the bill passed separately in pieces. But he helped get that through. He opposed the Wilmot Proviso, which was a bill that was introduced some 3 or 4 times that would have, it never passed. It would have prohibited any of the lands acquired as a result of the Mexican War from ever, ad infinitum, ever being slave states. And he strongly opposed it. He went back to Congress in 1859 and served for 2 more years until the war started. He went back to fulfill an unexpired term of a congressman who had died. And in 60, he was in the running for the Speaker of the House. The man was quite the politician, quite successful politician. But he was not elected by a whiskers width to the office of Speaker of the House because a coalition of Southern Democrats, remember he's a Douglas Democrat, the Southern Democrats got together and blocked his being elected as Speaker of the House because he was too soft on abolitionism. He was too soft about slavery. Something to keep in mind as a background is Shawneetown, Illinois is in southern Illinois, and it's in the area of Illinois known as Egypt, largely populated by people who had immigrated from Kentucky and Arkansas, Tennessee, and had moved for them north or to the west out of Kentucky, and was strongly Southern in its sympathies. John Logan was also, Congressman Logan, was also from that area. And there was a good deal of question about which way Logan would go. And I lift Logan up because I'm going to compare him and Mcclernand in this reflection. So he didn't get the Speaker of the House in 60. And he stayed in Congress until President Lincoln named him as one of the 4 brigadier generals of volunteers from Illinois. He was on, and he didn't resign his seat in Congress immediately. In fact, it was several months before John Mcclernand actually resigned his seat in Congress. Wanted to cover both ends of his candle, I expect, to make a play on a couple of proverbs. He was on the list with me. That list of 4 generals was myself, Stephen Hurlbut, Benjamin Prentice, and John Mcclernand. My name was first on the list of those 4 generals. Some 30 generals overall were named at one time, and from Illinois, I was the first. Now, in military ranking, by being the first on the list, I was the ranking brigadier general. John Mcclernand groused about that and fumed and was known to have frequently said that was merely a clerical error, that my name was first and his was not. I would point out that my name was first intentionally and that I was the only professional soldier of the 4 names. The other 3 were not. They were political appointees. But he was made a brigadier general, as was I, effective May the 17th of 1861. Now, to back up a little bit, I met Mr. Mcclernand, Congressman Mcclernand, and John Logan at the same time when I had returned to Springfield, Illinois, at Camp Yates to take command of the 21st Illinois. Now, my dilemma was that I had enrolled these men several weeks ago prior to that in Mattoon, Illinois, from which they came. They were 30-day men. Their 30 days were up. In fact, in a bit, they'd been extended a little bit. And they were really disturbed. They hadn't gotten into action. They hadn't got to see the elephant, as they put it. And about 1,200 had gone from Mattoon, Illinois, to Camp Yates in Springfield back in about early June or late May. And that 1,200 had melted away to about 600 by now, maybe less. And I was in great fear that I had at last gotten a command. I was a colonel, but my command was, so far as I could tell, about to all go home, and I would be a colonel without a command. In Springfield, the day before, in mid-June, I think June 19th, before they were to be either sworn in or go home, Mcclernand and Logan both told me they wanted to speak to my troops. Well, I had some concerns. I didn't really know Mcclernand. I did know of Logan, and he was down from Egypt in southern Illinois, as was Mcclernand, or had been there, in fact represented that area in Congress. And I was gravely concerned that Logan was going to make a position policy statement in using that opportunity to make a statement. I wanted my men to re-enlist, but what could I say? They were both congressmen. I had just been named colonel of volunteers. And they both went into the Army shortly thereafter. But Mcclernand made a real spread eagle speech. I was impressed. It was nothing less than a spread eagle, and got the men fired up. And then Logan did the same, and they all re-enlisted almost to the man. So I had a command that was going to be for the 3 years of the duration of the war. And I was very pleased with what both men had to say, both John Mcclernand and John Logan. And I had a good start, therefore, with Mcclernand. Now, as the weeks passed, in just a few months, I was at Cairo, Illinois, in command of the southeastern district of Missouri, and was told to make a demonstration down the river down the Mississippi toward Columbus, Kentucky. And on November the 7th, I made a demonstration. In fact, I took 3,000 men, cavalry and artillery, went down to Belmont, Missouri, and attacked Belmont. I thought, well, I will make a demonstration. And there was some concern that guerrilla activity in that area was going to be a real problem. And Leonidas Polk across the river at Columbus, Kentucky, was strengthening that position and over into Missouri. And I took my 3,000 troops. McClernand was second in command to me. And on November the 7th of 61, he distinguished himself for the most part. When we took Camp Johnston, as they had named it after General Albert Sidney Johnston, the discipline disappeared. Men were looting, seizing trophies. Officers were racing about making speeches, because all of these regiments elected their own officers. Well, that amounted to the regiments were simply hometown political units, because the political leaders in the town, or the wealthy in the towns, were voted in as officers. McClernand had done well in the fight until that time. And then he sits his horse at the flagpole at Camp Johnston. They'd taken down the Confederate flag and run up the Stars and Stripes, and McClernand began making a loud and long speech about the glories of the Union and freedom and Old Glory and political blatherskite. And I had to set fire to the tents to get the soldiers' attention back. Mcclernand finally pulled himself back under control and fought well, getting back to the boats and getting out of the Belmont fight. So he did well. Make no mistake, General McClernand is a courageous man. He is a good, even though he's a political appointee and has no military experience, he is a fast learner and is a natural leader. He did well at Belmont. He had 3 horses shot out from under him. I had 1 shot out from under me, but he was in the thick of the fight. He was a lead from the front officer and did well. Now, I didn't mention him in the after-action reports, and that greatly irked him. But he got all the headlines in the papers. I was barely mentioned. He was the great leader and the hero of Belmont, insofar as the journalists were concerned. And he got a personal letter from President Lincoln. And I should remind you that he and Lincoln had sort of grown up together, similar circumstances, similar careers, and worked together, either opposing each other many times or working together on cases many times. In fact, McClernand was working with the president on the last case that President Lincoln actually was involved in before he became president. These men are very closely related in politics and in the law, know each other well. But we went back to Cairo. He reaped the benefits and the glory from Belmont and got a letter from the president. He had great potential, and I had begun at that time to see some traits that were less than positive, but nonetheless, I looked well to come from him. We at Fort Henry, I was with his division, and of course that was when we were delayed because of the rain and the mud. And Flag Officer Foote took the fort. Lord Tillman surrendered it before we could get there. And then he took his troops on to Fort Donelson. We got there on February the 12th, invested the 13th, and I had left orders not to bring on an engagement. And this is where I began to have some difficulties with General McClernand. I said, do not bring on an engagement. And on the 13th, he opened fire on a rebel battery that was irritating him, as he put it, and attacked a rebel battery. It was Maney's battery, Humphreys County Artillery. Well, he thought he was swatting at a bee, and he knocked down the hornet's nest, and a sharp fight broke out. He was rolled back to his lines, almost went further than that. It almost got a lot worse than it could have been. He had 147 casualties. That was one of 3 unauthorized engagements that day, but he bit off more than he could chew, and I began to see perhaps what could be felt defiance. And the 14th, the water batteries pounded Flag Officer Foote's flotilla, badly pounded them. Flag Officer Foote was himself wounded in the ankle. His pilot was killed. His flagship, the St. Louis, was hit 59 times. The Louisville and the Pittsburgh were disabled, and it was almost a defeat for him. They did not take Fort Donelson like he did Fort Henry. He had called for me to come see him on the 15th, and at about 1 o'clock in the morning, I went to him with 1 aide, and his flagship, the St. Louis, was anchored a little north of the fort, 7 miles from my headquarters. Heavy ice, temperatures had been 10 below zero, 12 below zero. And I rode to meet him, and we met all morning. I had left orders not to bring on an engagement. I had no idea the rebels would attempt to get out, that they'd bring an engagement to us. And in the confusion and disorganization that was inside Fort Donelson, they escaped, they broke out, they hit Mcclernand's line. He had not properly anchored his line and pushed Mcclernand back nearly 2 miles. Lew Wallace, who acted without orders and saved the day, he flooded troops in, closed the gap, reinforced McClernand, and they stopped the arterial flow and the backpedaling of our lines. I learned from that whenever I left the field, I left somebody in command, and McClernand was restricted. He was told not to bring on engagement. It was brought to him, and he had to do something, preferably more than just defend himself. And he lost almost 2 miles. He sent messengers to my headquarters. They were ignored, and a messenger William Lago, did get to me, and he met me when I came off the boat about noon, and was white-faced and said, "There's been a battle, and it's not going well for us." And I was riding Jack. He's my favorite, and he picked his way very well over that sheet ice on the ground, and we got there as quickly as we could. When I got to the knoll where the fighting had been thickest, I encountered Lew Wallace, another political appointee general from Indiana, and McClernand. Now, as I got to them, men are standing around everywhere in groups and clots, and not just milling around. Hadn't been given any commands. They're out of ammunition. Ammunition is by the ton in crates all around them. And I told my chief of staff, Colonel Webster, get with these men, tell them to put 40 rounds in their cartridge boxes and get in line. We must renew the assault or take up the assault. And they did. And the men were just looking for some directions. Most of them are green men and not seen the elephant. Some had at Belmont. And when I approached McClernand and Lew Wallace, McClernand almost snarled at me, "This army wants a head." Now that, I crumpled the piece of paper I had in my hand. The aide with me, Lago, said that that's the only emotion I displayed. And I said, "I expect it does." And I looked at that terrain and I said, "Gentlemen, the ground that we've lost must be retaken. Do so." I turned my horse and rode away, as I normally would, never raised my voice. Went to C.F. Smith and told him, "You'd have to take that ground, lead the way." He said, "I'll do it." He stood up and led those men. We bolstered our lines, reloaded with the ammunition, and retook the lost ground. And for some reason, which is another reflection, Pillow's troops could have gone all the way to Charlotte, Tennessee. The river road had been opened, but yet they all came back into the trenches. They were called back, and that saved the day. Our vigorous counterattack and their falling back. But that was my first taste of disagreement with General McClernand, and I didn't forget it. I thought it unseemly to speak to his commanding officer the way he did. "This army wants a head." And yet he's got men standing all around him with no orders and no organization. But I'm glad that Lew Wallace acted as he did. Now, before I end these reflections, I'd like to go back and mention John Logan, or Blackjack Logan as he came to be called. Logan and McClernand were both in Congress at the same time. They both represented the same areas in southern Illinois, Egypt as it was known, which was a hotbed of southern sympathies. And the divergent paths of those two men is of note, because Logan became what I said was the best volunteer political general of the war. He was the best, unquestionably. And as you will see in our other reflections, about General Mcclernand and myself, Mcclernand became quite possibly the worst, or worst in behavior, because I want to say again, McClernand's courage is not to be questioned. His devotion to the Union is not to be questioned. His leadership capabilities were strong, but he had a disdain for military organization and structure and details. He wanted to be the boss and not bothered with anything else, I think could be a fair assessment. But McClernand, while not the worst leader by any means of the volunteer, the citizen political generals, his other traits proved to be his undoing. John McClernand was, I think, unquestionably his own worst enemy. In our next reflection, I shall think with you about what happened with McClernand at Shiloh, and more importantly, what happened with McClernand with President Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton behind closed doors and secret orders issued that would have certainly changed my career and possibly the outcome of the war. But for now, I must bid you an affectionate farewell, and I look forward to seeing you next time here in the War Room, where I will reflect again on my relationship, Grant and McClernand, Part 2, Shiloh and After. I bid you good day.